CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Delegates from more than 190 countries gather in Montreal for what experts are calling the last chance to reverse the decline of nature. Hello, I'm Mike Walter, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. Nearly 20,000 delegates are in Montreal for the second phase of the UN Biodiversity Conference known as COP15. Scientists, government officials, and activists are gathering to negotiate targets for protecting nature during this decade and beyond. China, which chairs the meeting, officially opened COP15 in the city of Kunming in October of 2021, after more than 2 years of pandemic-related delays. Delegates adopted the Kunming Declaration, calling on parties to urgently prioritize biodiversity protection and recognize the importance of conservation in protecting human health. On the eve of COP15, Anna Naidu spoke with the UN's chief executive of the Convention on Biological Diversity, Elizabeth Maruma Mrema.
Elizabeth, thanks so much for joining us. A senior Chinese official says there is broad agreement on the structure and core content of COP15 post-2020. What are the major outstanding issues, and what are your expectations from this conference?
Indeed, the structure is fairly already agreed or set in the sense that the draft framework has a long-term vision, which was agreed since 2010. It will have 4 goals and a set of about 22 actionable targets. Of course, both the goals and targets, we still have a number of those targets in brackets. Some of the issues where there are brackets, clearly it means there are still disagreements. But of course, you have brackets which one will look at them as easy to agree because either they are dependent on other targets, and those other targets have to be agreed to be able to come back to some other targets and do that alignment or streamlining. However, we know also there are some targets which major differences, probably one would say, remain. And if I may give few examples, one, many countries want to ensure that the framework to be adopted will also be accompanied with adequate means of implementation to ensure that then the framework can be implemented through tangible actions on the ground. And therefore, part of the means of implementation and key on the discussion table now is the question of resource mobilization and funds for implementation. In addition, other issues related to that include capacity building, technology transfer. The other issue is all targets actually propose numerical value, which will be used to measure progress as we go along to 2030, when it is expected if all targets are implemented effectively, then we'll be able to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity. All these numerical values are still in brackets, which means they still need to be agreed. The need for numerical values is agreed. What is not yet agreed for each and other targets, is it 10%, 20%, 50%, 30%, and the like. The other issue is to be able to ensure that progress is monitored as implementation proceeds during the decade. Is the issue of review, reporting, monitoring framework.
Now, one of the goals, Elizabeth, is to protect 30% of land and the oceans by 2030. It's become known as the 30 by 30 program. Is there agreement on that? And what kind of resources, including funding, can developing nations expect to fulfill their part of that obligation?
The 30 by 30, yes, many countries, parties, stakeholders are pushing and campaign for it, but it is not yet agreed. It is still in brackets. 1, 2, it is important also for me to underline 30 by 30 is just one target out of the 22 currently targets. For the framework to be effective, we need all the targets to be implemented. It's not cherry-picking. 1, 2, even if the land and sea protected area is demarcated by that 30 land, 30 sea, we still to ensure also effective management of the remaining 70% of the land or sea area. So again, we are looking at the all the targets in a package. Unless all are executed and implemented, then we will not be able to reach or to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. Another key area is we know many of these areas are the areas which are mainly or mostly being used by indigenous peoples and local communities. So also the target would like to ensure that there are appropriate safeguards and the rights of the indigenous peoples are equally taken on board, considered, to ensure that then that is part of the effectiveness of 30 by 30, in addition to the 70% outside the 30 by 30, and in addition to the entire other set of the targets.
Yeah, on the question of finance, there are big differences between the rich nations and the poor countries. The current biodiversity finance gap ranges from $600 billion to $825 billion per year. And there's a group of developing countries, and that group includes Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia. And what they are saying is that what we need is a commitment from rich nations to provide up to $100 billion per year now, and that figure should grow to something like $700 billion by 2030. But there's been some reluctance on the part of rich nations to make that commitment. Where do we stand right now on that?
The matter is still being discussed, is still on the table. And indeed, as I said earlier, for the framework to be effective, it means also effective implementation need to be guaranteed. 1, 2, there is even also a growing understanding and awareness of the connection and the direct link between changes in climate and loss of biodiversity. On one side is if countries have committed to $100 million for climate, and biodiversity is as important as climate, and biodiversity is expected to provide 30% of the climate mitigation, then it means there is need to put equally similar amount or more to ensure the loss of biodiversity does not continue, so that then climate can be mitigated. So that there is one. But we also need to understand, sadly, we are not in a, one will say, good economic period during these years. All countries are recovering from the post-COVID recovery.
Right.
We know the food insecurity situation of food security, energy prices, geopolitics. When all these put together, the bottom line comes to resources.
Right.
But what is also important, we know there are millions or trillions of dollars also being spent on harmful subsidies to biodiversity. Yeah. If these resources are redirected, repurposed to sustainable green biodiversity activities, already you can see the finance gap will be drastically reduced. If, for instance, what we know today, over $400 billion of subsidies being used in fossil fuel production, imagine this being repurposed into positive biodiversity activities. Again, we'll reduce that finance gap drastically.
Right, Elizabeth, you mentioned, the finances or the money that's being used towards what you call harmful biodiversity. What are the other factors that is driving biodiversity loss? I mean, you have said that the planet is in crisis.
Yes. The recent scientific reports, particularly the Intergovernmental Panel on Science, Biodiversity and Ecosystem, has identified 5 direct drivers, and these are changes in land and sea use, direct exploitation of natural resources, climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species. In addition, there are other indirect drivers of loss of biodiversity, and these include infrastructure, governance, rule of law, yes. So all these are the drivers to the loss of biodiversity, which then we need to deal with to be able to really transform the global environment. More so, it is sad to realize also from the different recent reports that we human beings have actually altered 97% of the ecosystems worldwide to date. So our actions as human beings on the land, on the sea, leading to climate change, pollution, increase in invasive species, need to drastically change.
Now, China has made enormous progress in biodiversity by creating national parks, by protecting wetlands. What, in your view, are some of China's biggest accomplishments when it comes to biodiversity?
China is our president of this conference of the parties, and delighted that China also has really taken steps and done a lot in terms of biodiversity conservation. In fact, China is one of the few countries who at national level had even exceeded some of the Aichi biodiversity targets, which globally we did not reach any. For instance, when it comes to protected areas, Aichi had called for 17% of protected land. China had already reached 25%, well above the global target. China has also been able to actually recover species which had almost gone to extinction or species which had been down listed in the IUCN Red List as threatened, actually graduated into vulnerable list of species like panda, which have basically almost gone to extinction and now recovered in China. We have seen China recently updating and reviewing its national legislations, particularly on wildlife, again to take into account the recent challenges and development, and COVID-19 being one of them. So these are some of the progress which China has made.
Elizabeth, thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure for having me. Thank you very much.
And there's a lot to talk about. Let's get right to our panel. Leila Salazar-Lopez is the Executive Director of Amazon Watch. Michael K. Dorsey is Director of Arizona State University's Walton Sustainability Solutions Service and a Chair Professor in the College of Global Futures. And Chunghua Wu heads the Beijing Future Innovation Center and the Professional Association for China's Environment, and that's who we're going to begin with. Let's take a deeper dive into the Kunming Declaration. A lot of folks who've looked at it say it's very ambitious and transformative. How does it, what would you say are the key takeaways, and how does it kind of set the stage for what we're likely to see in Montreal?
Well, thanks, Mike, for having me on the program again. And I think we all recognize the contribution, significant contribution of the first part of the COP15 in Kunming, particularly through the Kunming Declaration, because it has managed or succeeded in convening the global consensus about the key goals and targets, in particular the framework of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So that has laid a solid foundation for the continued negotiation, of course, leading up to today, this week, and next. Hopefully, somehow, global community will be able to address all those uncertain or disputed issues or factors still in brackets today. So by the end of the COP15, we'll be able to really successfully put together a global framework to guide our action to halt and reverse the loss of nature by the end of this decade there. Besides that, Chinese government, as the presidency of COP15, has been actively engaging with different parties throughout the world. As we said, we're talking about here, there are about 195 countries and parties to the convention. That takes a lot of efforts of coordination, engagement, consultation, so that we'll be able to have a successful outcome there. One other factor coming out of the first part of the Kunming COP is something called the Kunming Biodiversity Fund. Finance has become a major part or defining factor of the success or not of this process. Chinese government, as the presidency of the COP15, has initiated the first step to put 1.5 billion RMB, or about $233 million on the table to really supporting the global effort, so that more countries will come together to chip in resources and agreeing on more ambitious targets.
Let me ask you a follow-up, because Elizabeth made a very good point, I think, about the pandas and where China has come with that. But when you look at the World Wildlife Fund, they say global wildlife populations have declined about 69% on average from 1970 to 2018. And as Elizabeth points out, it's a planet in crisis. I mean, talk to us about that. Have we reached this kind of tipping point where if we don't make significant progress there, how do you reverse it?
Well, I think that the scientific assessment has been telling us globally, collectively, we've been failing. And that's why, more than ever, the sense of urgency of the success of this COP15, because we do need to immediately halt and reverse the continued loss of nature. If you look at the size, the numbers of the species, and also pace of loss of biodiversity, we are literally at a critical tipping point that we're really down, spiraling down literally, that already started to threaten the survival and existence of human species on this planet as well. And of course, through the last decade also, particularly through the Aichi targets, we generally failed in most cases, but China is one of the rare cases that have made some successes, which is definitely deserve the sort of credit. But as we all know, the planet is a system, so we cannot rely on just a spot, isolated locations for some single species actually success in order to really change the situation. That is why more than ever, yes, China has set some good examples and some cases that we could learn from, but collectively we need global efforts in order to really reverse the trend or the crisis we are in today.
Michael, let me talk to you about Akeem Steiner, the administrator of the UN Development Program. He sat down with my colleague, Suda Ju, and kind of talked about some of the key features that he's looking at when he looks at Montreal. But again, this 30 by 30 subject came up again, and I want to play what he had to say, and I want to get your reaction on the other side. Let's listen.
In COP15, there is a global biodiversity framework. That framework is meant to agree a series of 22 new goals and targets around which the world can essentially mobilize in addressing the issue of biodiversity in the larger context of sustainable development. But also in terms of, for instance, one particular target that is of great interest to many conservation organizations, to many of those who believe that we need to advance the protection of biodiversity against the backdrop of the continued loss and erosion of biodiversity, the destruction of ecosystems. It's the 30 by 30 target, which essentially looks towards a expansion of protected area regimes in the world to the level of 30% by the year 2030.
Michael, talk to us about this 30 by 30 target. And when we think about 2030, it's not that far away. How difficult will it be to hit this target?
So the 30 by 2030 target is absolutely important for motivating the world's countries. It's a process that if we can get it more ambitious and get resources into it, it's a process that can essentially begin to stop the war we're having on nature and on wilderness areas and on species around the globe. But the fact is, unfortunately, we haven't committed sufficient resources to this. The billion yuan that the Chinese have put in is important, certainly, but when you look at that in the larger context, we need about $1 trillion a year to really get out ahead of this crisis. So that billion yuan is looking more like a quarter when you, and I don't mean a %, about 25 cents as it were, if we were putting in, if we needed $1,000 to put it in context, because I think for some of your listeners, it's hard to imagine the trillions and billions here. So we're really, really short of the mark. Even the larger contributions, for example, the Germans committed at the recent UN General Assembly to put about $1.5 billion. In context, that's about the equivalent of giving $1.50 against a $1,000 debt. So the sums here are not fit for purpose and scale. They've got to increase not even by 10x or 100x, more like 1,000x to really properly put us on a course to meet that 30% protection of wilderness and wildlife by 2030, and we're nowhere near there yet.
And Michael, it's a good point, but I imagine if you were talking to finance folks in different countries, Germany, the United States, they'd say, hey, look, we've got energy prices, we've got inflation, we've got to still deal with COVID, we've got a looming recession. It's all these pressing issues right now. maybe I'll think about working on this a little bit later. That's the argument I know that you would face. What would you say to them?
Well, look, one of the things we definitely don't want to do is be in a crisis situation where we have to respond to the collapsing biodiversity like we had to respond to other crises, whether they're the pandemic crisis, whether it's economic crisis. We have the capacity to marshal and leverage trillions of dollars. We've done it for this past pandemic, the unfolding pandemic. We've done it for other global economic crises. We have the capacity and the resources to do this. We've got to actually make the commitments and increase the ambition in order to do so.
Leila, I think Michael makes a really good point. When you're pushed up against the wall, you have to respond, and we've seen that with the pandemic in many instances. In that interview, he also talked about the pandemic and the impact that it's had, and clearly it's created delays, and it's also prevented face-to-face negotiations, which are so important when you're looking to make strides here. Can you talk to us about the impact the pandemic has had, not just in that regard, but perhaps also in meeting some of these ambitious goals?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me, first of all. And, when I think about what we're facing, what we're up against, the biodiversity crises, the climate crises, a global pandemic, inflation, recession, racial inequities, all of this combined, we have our work cut out for us, for sure. Just coming off of COP27, the climate COP, and now, we're talking about the biodiversity COP, and we really have to see the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and the pandemic as interrelated. If we continue to treat nature, Mother Earth, the Amazon, if we continue to treat our natural world in this way, we will be having more climate crisis, and we will have more pandemics. That's one of the clearest things that I think we all realize coming out of this time that we've been living under. During the pandemic, I'm thinking of Brazil in particular, where there was a government which will be changing soon. But there was a government that denied COVID and denied the climate crises. And now we see Brazil leading in deforestation and degradation. We see the highest rates of deforestation, and we saw some of the highest rates of infection of COVID and deaths. And so, the Amazon rainforest, one of the most biodiverse places on our planet, is at a tipping point because of this deforestation and degradation, and because the protectors, the guardians of the forest, the indigenous peoples, the traditional peoples who are protecting the forests and the biodiversity of the forests and our climate and our health in turn, they're under attack as well.
Well, Leila, let's talk a little bit more about that. I mean, can this issue be reversed when you're looking at a situation like this where you see a difference in governments? I mean, we're seeing that here in the United States, where Joe Biden put forward this kind of aggressive, we've got to do something about climate change, and now you have Republican leadership in the House, and it looks like for the next 2 years you can put that aside. It's not going to happen. And we see this not just here in the United States. We see it in Brazil. We see it in a number of countries where it's kind of these fits and starts. That's a real problem, isn't it?
Well, it goes back to reality, the crisis that we're facing, and the political will, for sure. And as other colleagues were mentioning, the finance. We have enough money for war. We have enough money. We can give billions for war. But as one of my colleagues, the general coordinator of COICA, which is the coordinating body of the indigenous people of the Amazon, what he said recently was, for 3 days of financing the war machine around the world, we could have the financing to protect our climate and biodiversity, to protect the Amazon. And what we're calling for actually is not 30 by 30. We're calling for 50 by 30. We need to protect half of nature. There's a lot of us out there that are saying, let's protect at least half of nature to protect biodiversity. But we also, for the Amazon, that's not enough. For the Amazon, we are saying we need to protect 80% of the Amazon by 2025. That's not going to happen, that's not going to happen if we continue to stall and have arguments about finance. We need the commitments in the next 10 days. We need the commitments to protect the Amazon, and then we need the finance to come after, and we need the political will, which the newly elected president of Brazil, the newly elected president of Colombia, they have committed to zero deforestation and protecting the Amazon.
And Chunghwa Wu, is that part of the problem? I mean, we're talking about finance, there's just not enough finance there, but also, as she pointed out, perhaps we're not even being ambitious enough.
That has been a challenge. It will continue to be, particular, we call it the age of polycrisis. With all things happening now, with all the distractions, other priorities there, we are pretty much scattered, distracted by other so-called priorities. But really, at the end of the day, we are part of nature. We are nature. And so protecting biodiversity is absolutely the #1 priority. Global community needs to come together to do so. A couple of points I do want to add here. One, even though at the national level there are success and the failures there, but we all know biodiversity doesn't recognize, national boundaries there, borders there. We need a global collective sort of efforts there. In the meantime, in terms of resources, as we're talking about here, there is finance available everywhere for other things which are harmful to the environment, to the biodiversity today, literally threatening our survival. Somehow, that's why more than ever, we need the highest level of political willingness, actually, from all around the world to get together to really drive the change. By the way, more than 50% of our global GDP relies on the healthy functioning of the ecosystems there. So it's not a separate thing. It's one thing in it. We need to recognize the sense of crisis, sense of urgency, and also we need more than ever immediate actions to do so.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. A great discussion. I want to thank all of our panelists. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching.
This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.